Ladies and gentlemen, as Rector of St Bride's, the Journalists' Church, I welcome you here very warmly this evening. This annual endowed lecture was established in memory of Tom Olsen, an outstanding journalist and author who was also a very great supporter of St Bride's. I have great pleasure in handing over to David Selves, who will be introducing our speaker and chairing this evening for us. David is a man of many talents and multifaceted interests. He describes himself as being, amongst other things, a speaker, auctioneer, chairman and thriller writer. He's also on the editorial advisory board of the Ethical Publishers Association and deputy chairman of the London Press Club. So, ladies and gentlemen, David Selves.
Thank you, Alison. You see the danger of letting your PR company write what's said. I'm just a simple street boy. And it's my great privilege and pleasure to be here tonight to welcome you, following Alison's welcome, into St Bride's, the Journalists' Church, the home of British journalism, Fleet Street. We may live in different times where it's transmitted differently, it's printed differently, but at the end of the day, as I'm sure we will hear, it's the journalist who goes out and gets the story. Now tonight is special. It is the 25th Tom Olsen Lecture, and we are extremely grateful to Casio, have I pronounced that correctly? Kaiser, who are city communications consultants, for supplying the refreshments afterwards. So thank you very much for doing that. The lecture is going to be given by Courtney Radsch, who is an advocate director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. She serves as chief spokesman on global press freedom issues for the organisation and oversees their engagements with the United Nations. They campaign on behalf of journalists killed and who are imprisoned for their work. As a veteran journalist, researcher and free expression advocate, she frequently writes articles and speaks about the intersection of media, technology and human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, Courtney Radsch.
Good evening. It is such an honor and a pleasure to be here to deliver the annual Tom Olsen Lecture, and especially in a church that is called the Journalists' Church, in front of a memorial to journalists who have paid the ultimate price for their job. And I just want to thank you for that opportunity. I am an enemy of the people. At least that is what my president has called me and many other journalists working around the world, pitting us against our fellow citizens, even though we are in this field to serve them. This clarion cry has reverberated around the world as those in power pillory journalists and denigrate the media as fake news. And as the public struggles to figure out what is fact, what is true in a post-truth era. Journalism is the light that disinfects the dark halls of power. But when journalists and the media are branded as enemies of the people, when they're thrown in jail for publishing the news, for daring to report, when they're killed with impunity, this light fades. And amid the obfuscation and the redirection of those who would rather not really bother with pesky reporters digging into what's happening behind the curtain, digging into the corruption and cronyism that's happening, it is the public and the citizenry, it is us who pays the price. So first I want to address the issue of real fake news. So the real issue of disinformation and media manipulation in this information ecosystem. And then I will discuss the weaponization of fake news and the constant labeling of journalists as enemies of the people, the framing that this poses as a danger to them. And we'll hear the stories of these journalists and the statistics of the very real dangers that journalists face and the ultimate price they have paid. But I'm going to conclude with a discussion of how we're fighting back, how the media and journalists are fighting back to bring the tools of their trade, the tools of their craft to bear in solidarity and to bring justice to those journalists murdered for their work or under threat. So we're going to end on a positive note. Freedom of the press plays a critical role in upholding all other human rights. It is a critical pillar of democracy. And in non-democratic countries, journalists are often some of the only ones doing the reporting that is revealing anything of public interest, that are helping people in those authoritarian contexts know about core issues of public interest. Of course, not to mention reporting on cronyism and corruption. When I worked as a journalist in Dubai in 2008 during the economic boom through 2009 during the economic crash, I found this out the hard way. As the economic downturn turned into an economic free fall, the Dubai legislature decided they were talking about a law to criminalize the publication of news that negatively impacted the economy. So it was almost like they were trying to legislate us into writing false news because there were literally no other stories at that time. And one day I published a story about safety problems on the national airline, which is like a pretty basic public safety story. There had been a crash in Australia and there was a report by the FAA. So I published this story and it seemed like a pretty straightforward public safety story. It wasn't about human rights, it wasn't about women's rights in the Gulf. I knew those were red lines. And in Dubai, the head of the airline is also the head of the civil regulatory authority for the airline industry, and is also related to the ruling power. So things got a little bit more complicated. The day after I published this story, I was made redundant. My visa was canceled, my bank accounts frozen, and I was forced to leave the country. So I found out that those red lines exist everywhere. It wasn't just about human rights and women's rights. And I was lucky that I didn't have to pay a greater price like so many of my colleagues. And I was also lucky because that helped me transition into press freedom advocacy and into a career where I get to advocate on behalf of journalists and use journalism to protect journalists. And in the decade since I've become a press freedom advocate, I have never seen things so bad for journalists. But we should not despair. Despite these trying times, because I also want to talk about what the media fraternity has turned its spotlight on the threats and on the dangers that journalists face and the innovative solutions like the One Free Press Coalition that have emerged to push back against this deterioration of press freedom worldwide. Now, we know that the battle of truth and reality and the media in this has always been fraught. So in 1794, there was a French law set up by the Revolutionary Tribunal that would punish enemies of the people and codified the spreading of false news and fake news as a political crime punishable by death. So we are lucky that now this is no longer a capital offense, but spreading false news is still a criminal offense. Today, countries around the world are criminalizing journalism. They are adopting fake news laws ostensibly aimed at staunching the flow of disinformation, but what we know is it's being used to imprison journalists. In the years since President Donald Trump made fake news his mantra, we have seen the number of journalists imprisoned on fake news charges or false news charges more than triple from its previous high. And according to the Poynter Institute, at least 48 countries have initiatives aimed at restricting or sanctioning misinformation. So this incendiary rhetoric destroys global norms, and it creates an environment that is conducive to repression, and it inculcates the public against truth and against fact. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, which systematically tracks the number of journalists killed and imprisoned, Trump has posted more than 1,300 tweets attacking or being critical of the media. This represents more than 11% of all of his tweets, and we know he tweets a lot. I'm sure they cover that in the news here as well. And his rhetoric appears to be escalating because it started with fake news, and then it was about journalists as the opposition party, and now journalists as enemies of the people. And Trump uses his tweets to respond and react to critical coverage or investigative reporting in the media. And part of it is a strategy that he was reported to have said is aimed at delegitimizing and demeaning the press so that when they write negative stories about him, nobody will believe them. And it seems to be working for him and for many leaders around the world. So Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro has tarred the media as fake news, and he has used his Twitter account in a way that echoes his counterpart in the United States. Rodrigo Duterte, the president of the Philippines, has called the media spies, has restricted their access to public events, and has used trumped-up tax evasion charges to restrict reporting on his deadly drug war that has left tens of thousands of people dead. Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister who is overseeing the deterioration and dismantling of democratic institutions, including the press in Hungary, said that Trump represents her mission from the highest position in the world. So for presidents of democratic countries to stand at a podium, to stand at the helm of their Twitter feed, and constantly attack the press as fake news and label them enemies of the people is dangerous. Coming as it does when freedom of the press is under threat worldwide, they are deepening that damage both home and abroad, and they are making the world less safe for journalists while attempting to inoculate the public and inoculate themselves from criticism and accountability. And many of the same actors who bandy around the term fake news to denigrate the media are actually engaged in their own algorithmically propelled, bot-inflected campaigns of propaganda and disinformation. So disinformation armies have been deployed by countries around the world. So perhaps it's not surprising that those in power keep trying to deflect attention from themselves by attacking the truth tellers. And across the political spectrum, governments and powerful elites are weaponizing information. They are raising armies of bots to drown out authentic speech, to warp perceptions, to attack critics, and fuel political polarization. I'm sure I don't have to tell you here in the UK about political polarization. According to the Computational Propaganda Project, at least 28 countries around the world have weaponized disinformation campaigns, and these include countries as varied as Bahrain and Brazil and the United States and the UK. Russian propaganda, of course, and disinformation operations are seeking to manipulate elections around the world, and they are undermining trust in our institutions and in democracy. So this manipulation and this mistrust of the media and political polarization end up weakening journalistic coverage and the public discussion of key issues of public interest. And they hollow out the center of the political divide, the political spectrum. And it makes it more difficult to have rational, informed public discussions. It makes it harder for moderate positions to be heard. And it destroys the critical public sphere that the public depends on, especially in a democracy. And yet at the same time, faster and faster, wider content distribution, the 24/7 news cycle, social media, all of these are making it increasingly difficult to decipher what information is valuable. And it's blurring the line between fact and fiction. And meanwhile, journalists are trying to fight back with one hand tied behind their back. They are being economically devastated as the economic model is under attack from new social media platforms, the new economic environment, even as they must compete to be heard through the morass of information. And meanwhile, media companies are grappling with government takedown requests, with efforts to thwart entire blockages, and they are also looking inward at what measures they can take to combat fake news on their own platforms. So we've seen fact-checking initiatives, we've seen Google and Facebook and others partnering with media outlets to try to curtail or restrict the the flow of disinformation on these platforms. And this is coming at a time when news outlets are struggling to find a sustainable economic model, when these local news outlets are dying and withering away, when entire beats go unreported. And while the threat of real, deliberate disinformation is a threat, it is difficult for even the most well-intentioned government to address the problem of false news or fake news without impinging on journalism and on the free flow of information. When governments have taken legislative action, we've often seen that the language has been loosely crafted, that implementation has been shoddy, and that there is a lack of mechanisms to ensure accountability, transparency, or reversibility. And in several cases, it has given authorities who are already hostile to the press an excuse to crack down and double down on repression. And double down, indeed, they have. Just a few weeks ago, Trump increased his incendiary rhetoric by labeling and accusing the New York Times of treason. A few weeks later, he was chatting with Putin about their mutual problem with fake news on the one-year anniversary of the 5 employees of the Capitol Gazette who were murdered and who are sitting, there's a photo of them on the Journalist Memorial here, joking with President Putin. And experts have noted that branding someone as an enemy of the person in some contexts can be a death sentence. And we don't think that President Trump really wishes death on his enemies. But this type of rhetoric is a nod to extremists and to authoritarians. He has resurrected a trope, enemies of the people, that even the former leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, said was specifically introduced for the purpose of physically annihilating such individuals who disagreed with the supreme leader, and called for the end of the use of the term. So why has he resurrected it? Journalism is dangerous enough without being labeled enemy of the people. Journalism is the only profession I can think of where its practitioners are routinely murdered because of the work that they do. We know when we go into journalism that it is potentially dangerous. We know it's going to be risky. But reporters and photojournalists cannot simply sit on the sidelines. They have to go to the front lines. They go to the front lines because they need to tell the stories of those they serve, the public. And the front lines are dangerous. We have reported more than 201 journalists who have been killed in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan covering the wars there. Killed in crossfire, killed on dangerous assignment. But nearly as many have been murdered there. And of the 1,344 journalists that CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, has documented over the past decades that we have been keeping records since 1992, more than 2/3 of journalists were murdered. And as Lasantha Wickramatunga, a Sri Lankan journalist who was murdered in 2009, wrote in his last column, which was published posthumously, he said, no other profession calls on its practitioners to lay down their lives for their art, save the armed forces, and in Sri Lanka journalism. But we must add to this list Mexico, Brazil, India, Russia, the Philippines. I mean, frankly, I could go on and on with a huge list of countries where this is the case, where journalists must lay down their lives because they are reporting on uncomfortable facts like corruption, human rights, environmental degradation, or terrorism, or because they dare to opine. Jamal Khashoggi was a columnist who used to live in Saudi Arabia and went into self-imposed exile in Washington, D.C., worked for the Washington Post, because he wanted to be able to talk about his criticism in Saudi Arabia of authoritarianism there. And this was coming at a time when Saudi Arabia was on a massive PR offensive to promote its new crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, as a reformer. As if somehow in 2018, allowing women to drive was some sort of sign of progress. So I remember the day that Jamal went missing, and I got a lot of texts from journalists that I am still friends with in the Middle East and at the Post, asking, had I heard about what happened? Was the Committee to Protect Journalists going to do something about it? And we did. We put out an alert, we put out a statement calling for information from authorities, asking for information. And over the next several days, bits and tidbits of information started leaking out, mainly from Turkey. So, day by day, we found out a little bit more. And Turkey, meanwhile, is the world's leading jailer of journalists for the past 3 years running. So it had some sort of vested interest in this. And we can only figure how massively surveilled the Saudi embassy or consulate must have been to have that information trickling out. Now, the title of Jamal's last column, which was also published posthumously, was tragically ironic. It was, "What the Arab world needs now most is free expression." That was his last column. His columns were translated into Arabic, so that probably didn't make the Saudis happy. Following a list of recent cruelties in this last column, he wrote, "These actions no longer carry the consequences of a backlash from the international community. Instead, these actions may trigger condemnation, quickly followed by silence." His condemnation of inaction and the impunity of authoritarians in the region who crack down on journalists should have been a rallying cry to any government and anyone who supports press freedom, who cares about the role of journalism in a representative society. Instead, we heard from President Trump that arms sales to Saudi Arabia are more valuable than this journalist's life. We heard from Congress, we heard from the EU about the need for sanctions, and we saw some little sanctions put on low-level people, but just last week, Mohammed bin Salman was shaking hands with all of these world leaders at G20. We heard tepid comments from the United Nations Secretary General, but we saw no independent investigation or criminal investigation opened to find out what happened. Instead, what we have seen is that media organizations have stepped up and mobilized in response to this latest attack on the press. So the Washington Post, to its credit, will mobilize its reporting resources to report on every development of Saudi obfuscation and what was happening. But it also launched a press freedom partnership in which the Committee to Protect Journalists and a handful of other organizations are given ad space and digital takeovers and press outreach so that we can raise the case of journalists who are under threat, ideally before it's too late. There's also, shortly after Jamal's death, there was a group of leading editors from global media who met at the World Economic Forum on the sidelines in Davos. It was just a couple months after Jamal had been assassinated. 2 Reuters journalists were in prison for reporting on genocide in Myanmar. It was the 3rd year of record numbers of journalists being in prison for their work. And they sat around dinner saying, okay, what can we do as editors, as the media, to help shift the balance of power between those who are under attack, these individual journalists, recalibrate the massive power differential between individual journalists and these elites and these powerful players who attack and murder them. And so this gave birth to the idea for a One Free Press coalition. This coalition now includes, and it got started in like a month, which is very fast for anything to be coordinated among global groups. And it now includes more than 30 media organizations, some of the leading global news organizations, and we're trying to get more local organizations on board now. There's an estimated reach of 1 billion people. And so every month, this coalition commits to publish a top 10 list of the most urgent cases of journalists who are under threat. Now, it is not easy for the Committee to Protect Journalists to figure out which of the hundreds of cases of journalists who need support, who need assistance, more than 250 who are behind bars, the more than 50 who were killed last year in the line of duty, the more than 2/3, who have been murdered, which ones to highlight. But we try to think about where can this spotlight make a difference? And so CPJ, along with the International Women's Media Foundation, curate this list of 10 journalists. And we figure who is under the greatest threat, and where can this spotlight help bring justice to their murder, or help change the calculus if they're imprisoned, or provide them solidarity when they're under threat. And being on this list gives these journalists some strength, and it keeps governments accountable. Because if you harass or attack or imprison or kill a journalist, the world will know. And we've had some successes. Nicaraguan journalists Lucia Pineda and Miguel Mora, who appeared on the lists in April and May, were released last month from prison. And in April, we included Rana Ayub, an Indian journalist who has reported on corruption in the Modi regime and who was the subject of really disgusting online harassment campaigns, deepfake pornographic videos, and death threats. We featured her on the list, and it spurred a conversation about threats that journalists face just before elections in India. And it spurred a debate in the Indian media about whether democracy is possible without press freedom. And this is a really important debate for the world's largest democracy to have. And she told me shortly after that having this international coverage helped create permissive conditions for the local press to cover these issues, to talk about these issues. So this is a really important coalition. It's important that the media organizations have realized they too need to stand and fight for journalists. And I had a chance to talk with Maria Ressa, who's a Filipina journalist, runs one of the country's most popular websites called Rappler, and she was featured on the list at its inception. Now, Rappler, in retaliation for its reporting on Duterte's deadly drug war, on Duterte's trolling campaigns and other issues, has faced a rash of intimidation. Maria faces the threat of arrest. She's been charged with tax evasion. She has paid more in fines to post bail than the former dictator Ferdinand Marcos ever paid. We've started a fund to help her pay that. And Maria also impressed her gratitude for being on this list because it helped her finally be granted the right to travel and allowed her to post bail the last time she was arrested. So since it began at the beginning of the year, the coalition has highlighted 35 journalists from 25 countries. 3 of these journalists were murdered in retaliation for their work, and no one has been held accountable. And we know from our systematic reporting and tracking of this that in 9 out of 10 cases of journalists who were murdered, the killer goes free. We are going to change this. The brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the continuing impunity for those who ordered and carried out the murder, in addition to the ongoing impunity for Daphne Caruana Galizia, a Maltese investigative journalist, Malta being an EU country, Miroslava Breach, Mexican journalist who was reporting on corruption, all of them who are on the list. There are just 3, but there are so many more that we are going to have to raise. And one can only assume that those who murdered them hoped to silence them and to send a signal to other journalists that this reporting is off limits, that these issues are going to stoke fear and inculcate self-censorship. And guess what? They have not. Others have galvanized the journalistic community to double down on investigations and to use their craft to combat fear and impunity. The mobilization of the journalistic community is an important development in the fight for press freedom. It is one thing that we at the Community to Protect Journalists do. We do investigations into the murders, for example, and into the investigations of the murders. So we went to the Ukraine and investigated the murder of investigative journalist Pavel Sheremet. And we have done reports about the dozens of journalists murdered in Pakistan, India, Mexico, and using things like the Last Column book, which features their last column, to personalize what is lost when these journalists are killed. There's another initiative called Forbidden Stories, which has built a global network of journalists and media outlets who are devoted to continuing the investigations of journalists when they were assassinated. So its first project was the Daphne Project, and it comprised 45 journalists from 15 countries representing 18 media outlets, a really amazing collaboration that spanned 5 countries. And they collaborated on a series of stories to continue her investigations into corruption by the Maltese government, including the embezzlement of EU funds, and drawing on the evidence that the 53-year-old journalist had accumulated over her 30 years of reporting. And in 2018, they launched the Deadly Border Project, which was an investigation into the kidnapping and murder of Ecuadorian journalist Javier Ortega, photographer Paulo Rivas, and their driver Efrain Zagara. And they worked in partnership with 19 Colombian and Ecuadorian journalistic outlets to continue the investigation into the issues that they were covering at the Ecuadorian and Colombian border, and to keep their stories alive, to send the signal that you cannot kill a journalist and think their stories are going to die. This is no longer an option. And these journalists were not enemies of the people. Javier was investigating links between the police and drug cartels. Daphne was reporting on government corruption and misuse of taxpayer funds. As long as you're part of the EU paying dues, you know, some of your funds probably. Pavel was reporting on the unchecked power of militias, and Jamal was reporting on the fundamental need for human rights. These were not fake news stories. These were real stories about real issues that had real importance to the public and to the citizenry. And according to research by the Committee to Protect Journalists, government officials and politicians are responsible for more than half of the murders of journalists since we began keeping records. So yes, we should be worried when politicians call journalists enemies of the people, when they accuse them of treason, when they undermine trust and accountability by labeling them fake news and accusing them of treason. And we must push back. We must fight back against the weaponization of disinformation by doubling down on journalism. We must all stand together to protect journalists. We must protect those journalists who are on the front lines, and I hope that you will all join me. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. We're ahead of the timetable, as you will see, so we've got plenty of time for questions. Once I've acknowledged you, I will come back to you. There is a microphone roving, or I think 2 mics. Peter's got one, so Peter's got 2 microphones. So we will pick you out in turn, but there are 7 words I put down there that actually strike fear. Never seen things so bad for journalists. You gave us a lot of information, a lot of facts, but those 7 words, I think, sum it all up, and the dangerous times in which we're living. The idea is we're going to stand for questions. So the gentleman over there with his hand up, if we can take your question. And please, a question, not a statement, not a speech. Any more questions?
We are sitting in a church here, and Christians and Jews have had a name for people who look at society, tell the truth and get killed, or Muslims for doing it. You call those prophets. Could you comment on any special role you may see of religious institutions in intervening in the situation that you described?
Thank you so much for that question. I think that is an incredibly important idea, and yes, we have seen some role for that. So a couple of months ago, the Pope actually made a speech about the importance of press freedom. And we had met a few weeks before that with the Holy See mission to the UN. We wanted to talk to them about the need that we have for champions of press freedom, for champions of journalists, especially amid the abdication of the United States from its role as a normative leader. We need strong normative leaders, and I absolutely think that that is where churches and religious organizations, regardless of denomination, regardless of religion, can have a role to play. When we were advocating for the release of the Nicaraguan journalists who I mentioned, we asked the Holy See to make a specific intervention, to raise their cases with the government, to use their good offices to request their release. There are journalists who are in prison and facing the death penalty. So that's something that it would seem that many churches could get behind. I think there is an absolute need for more of that, and I would welcome ideas on how we can mobilize that. How does that happen? In many countries, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, largely atheist, we see that journalists are under attack. So there's no one, religion that has a role to play. But I think that urging those with religious power and influence to raise this as an issue that is so fundamental. And we also see that there is a relationship between freedom of religion and freedom of the press. So in Pakistan, for example, they have blasphemy laws. And blasphemy laws are actually incredibly dangerous for journalists, not to mention others. I did a study a while back looking at the impact of blasphemy laws on freedom of expression. And what we found, this was at Freedom House, we found that actually there's a correlation between the existence of blasphemy laws and greater danger for the press. So this is the type of thing where, it would be interesting to see religions get involved in. And those who have been persecuted for practicing their religion depend on journalists to tell their stories. We see this in China with the Uyghur population, with the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, all over the world. I mean, so much of what we know about the threats that those trying to practice their religion freely come because journalists have gone in to try to cover those issues. I mean, the Myanmar journalists from Reuters were imprisoned because they were reporting on a genocide with religious dimensions. So these two issues are completely intertwined, and I think we would so welcome that solidarity from the religious community and religious leaders taking up this issue for their own. Thank you so much for that question.
Thank you, Courtney. Can we have the gentleman in the front with the red trousers, please? And next question.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting, and it raises many questions to me, which there's time to answer, but to ask. But right at the very beginning, you stressed the importance of democracy and, of course, freedom of the press, which I agree. Are you sure that the United States is democratic when you have an organisation which appoints the president contrary to the wishes of the populace? Secondly, appoints the Supreme Court in accordance with his political agenda. Is that a democracy?
So I'm going to take off my representative of the Committee to Protect Journalists and the One Free Press Coalition and put on my International Relations PhD hat to answer that question, because that's obviously a personal opinion, and my organization is a nonpartisan organization. We work with everyone because we believe this is a nonpartisan issue. To answer your question, I think that there are many forms of democracy, and I am concerned about what is happening in my country. I'm definitely concerned about the partisanship in the Supreme Court. I don't think, based on what I've read in the literature, that there is necessarily more democracy to be had in appointed versus elected judges. I think there are pros and cons to long terms that have, that span several decades in order to have some stability, but it definitely seems more politicized since I've been aware as a citizen in the United States. Personally, I don't believe the Electoral College provides any sense anymore when we have the technology that would allow us to have direct voting, and it gives certain citizens an outsized vote. Some votes are much more worthwhile than others. I live in Washington, D.C. My vote is essentially useless. We're also disenfranchised, with the exception of the presidential election. So I think we should be deeply concerned about the political polarization. I don't think that just because we have a federal system with indirect representation makes it not a democracy. But I definitely think that democracies are something that happen as a practice. It is not like you are a democracy and yay, you get to be a democracy for the rest of your existence. Democracy is a set of practices, a set of institutions that have to be put into practice every single day. We have to practice our free speech, our freedom of religion, our representative electoral politics. I wish we had more than two choices for parties. And again, but there are two-party systems, there are parliamentary systems. It is interesting because in the political science literature, it does seem that two-party systems, federal systems, can give way to tyranny more so than parliamentary systems. But again, there's no perfect answer to that. And yes, America is still a democracy, but it is something that we have to practice. And as we get more political partisanship on the courts or, in the idea that somehow money is equivalent with speech, I think goes back to what I was talking about with the algorithmic and the bottification of speech. How do we fight speech with better speech when you can just buy an army of bots to drown out anything? So I do think we need to update some of our paradigms to take account for some of these new technological realities and the information system. And I think decisions like Citizens United that equated money with speech are highly problematic. And again, fully my own opinion and not either of my organizations.
We've moved slightly away there from our theme. On the subject of democracy, where would you be with the Australian system where it's illegal not to vote?
I love the idea personally.
You do?
We have such poor voter turnout in the United States.
Is that apathy?
Apathy, lack of choice, lack of inspiration, voting restrictions, the efforts to disenfranchise African Americans, Hispanics, to scare people away from the polls. There's a whole host of factors at play there. But Australia, man, I am also worried about what's happening there because just a couple of weeks ago we saw the federal, I can't remember now what they call it, but basically the federal police raided the home of a journalist and spent 7 hours in her house getting all of her materials, and the next day they raided ABC News and took all of their files. Luckily there was an injunction, to let them see which materials they were going to have access to, but that's deeply, deeply problematic.
Is this the raid related to something 12 years ago?
This was, yes, related to reporting on national security. And I mean, national security is an excuse that we hear from governments around the world, whether they're democratic or undemocratic. It's the most common excuse used to raid newsrooms, to restrict press freedom, to put journalists in jail. So 75% of the journalists in jail, or 2/3, are in jail on anti-state charges, so related to, for example, national security breaches or terrorism.
And what countries are they typically?
And the journalists in jail. So Turkey, China, and Egypt, well actually Egypt is above China, account for more than half of all journalists jailed. So if we could address those three countries, we would have a massive reduction in the number of journalists jailed. Turkey, China, and Egypt. The rest of Saudi Arabia is high on that list. Iran has typically been on that list. They just let a bunch of journalists out who had served their sentences. Eritrea. There are really, around the world, there are a handful of countries that are putting journalists in jail systematically on a regular basis. And that's where I'd like to see the UK, which is hosting this big media freedom conference with Canada here, which is why we're here in London, in part, and here with some colleagues from sister organizations. I would like to see the UK use its normative power and this idea of champion press freedom to really put pressure on those countries that are not democracies, that are imprisoning journalists, to get them out of prison. Because we have seen more than 250 journalists behind bars for the past 3 years, and we have never seen that many. So we've got record numbers of journalists being killed, record numbers of journalists being imprisoned. This is why I said it's the worst time I've ever seen for journalists.
Never seen things so bad for journalists. The gentleman there with the glasses and then the gentleman with the pink shirt at the back.
I'd just like to go back to the potential role that the church, Christian people, or faith people can play. And you very clearly set out the story of the American president who, through his tweets, is degrading truth. So, obviously, we know the story of certain sections of the evangelical church in America supported him. Do you see any signs of religious people in your country who are beginning to rally around your side? And are there lessons we can learn for people of faith in this country too?
That's a great question. I have not seen that there is a noticeable movement among religions to come to the defense of journalists. I don't know that that means at an individual level that people aren't. But I did get into a debate with one of my relatives who is a very devout, born-again Christian, and we were talking about an attack that had occurred by an elected representative, the day before he got elected as a representative to Congress. He attacked a journalist, and I said, the term all of the reporting used was body slammed, and I think I said attacked or something, I used a different term. And he started quibbling with me about, the term. And I was very surprised to hear from somebody who is religious that we were quibbling about the term versus the broader principle. And I think that, there's so much partisanship, there's so much polarization in the country, it's really hard. But I think individual people who are religious, who do believe in, these fundamental values of practicing your faith freely, you can't really, how can you separate that from expression? How can you then separate that from press freedom? These are all interrelated. And I think if you're thinking about it at an individual level, what can people of faith or anyone who cares about these issues do? There are a few things you could do. Let's not use fake news offhand. I used it tonight because I want to talk to some very important rhetoric. But, don't let people get away with that. Think about paying for your news. I think many religious people tithe or provide support to their religious institution where they practice. It's similar with journalism. Good journalism takes money. Staying safe takes money. It takes money to buy, to get the right training, to buy body armor if you're going to the front lines, to buy secure communication devices and know how to use them. If you're reporting on corruption, for example, or trying to evade government listening, which is harder and harder. So I think those are things you can do at an individual level to push back. And one thing I've started just to do personally on my Twitter feed is whenever I read a story, because most of what I know comes because I read the press, whenever I read a story about something that was revealed by a journalist, so now we know, for example, I just tweeted this yesterday, Amazon, Alexa maintains for eternity the voice files. We only know that because a journalist from CNET did an investigation. So I try to highlight that, we know this because of journalists. The investigations in the US, we had a water crisis in Flint, Michigan, where basically water was poisoning people. It's unbelievable in a country as rich as America that this could happen. But again, the reason we knew about that is because of journalists. I met one of the USA gymnasts who was a victim of sexual assault. And she said one day she got a call from a journalist asking her if she had been sexually assaulted by Dr. Nasser. And that was what opened up the entire story because the journalist asked questions and was reporting about it. I'm just constantly struck by how much of what we know about what is happening in our world is because of journalists. So I think if we can recognize that, read the bylines, or when you're listening to the news or reading your daily email newsletter, look at the bylines. Think about who decided to devote their career for usually poor salary, to bringing us this news, whether we're talking about the front lines of Yemen or opining about what something means for you as a citizen. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Thank you.
That's my question, really. I've already answered. Thank you.
Then 1, 2, 3.
Oh, I think you said that was your question.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Then we got gentleman here. No, forward. Peter, gentleman, and then we'll come over here.
A very important gentleman said, thank you very much, so don't take this the wrong way. Fully agree with everything you said. But in terms of democracy, I wonder what your feeling is about the journalists who 2 years ago, roughly 2 years ago, with regard to the litigation over the departure from Brexit from the European Union, described our Supreme Court judges as enemies of the people.
I don't know that specific instance, but in general, I'm going to say let's not call any people of any specific profession enemies of the people. That is a dangerous trope. I mean, as you heard, like this is something that Mao used, that Stalin used. No one, I don't care if you're a journalist or a politician or anyone, like should be using this sort of terminology to delegitimize and denigrate another person or another profession. It's dangerous. But I think it's interesting because you mentioned journalism and Brexit. You know, one of the challenges that journalism is having today is, you know, journalism takes place obviously on the internet. You know, most of what we know and how we get our information is because we're reading it on an app or Facebook or maybe going directly to a news site. And the algorithms and the way that these information systems are designed favors extremism. It favors the click. It favors the engagement and the open rates. Now, you can read a headline that says 50 people killed in Syria, and that encapsulates the story. So maybe you're not going to click on that, but that doesn't make that story any less important than a story that you might want to open up and read further in. Meanwhile, you've got stories that are clearly, we all heard the term clickbait. It's really hard to get, straightforward news to compete. It's very hard to get local news to compete in this environment. We see entire news deserts. In the United States, there was a report that said there are like 1,300 news deserts in the U.S. where there are no local news. And I think I think it's similar here, where the sustainability of local news. How do they compete when 98%, if I remember correctly, of digital advertising revenue goes to Facebook and Google? They are getting minimal percentages. I think I just saw another journalist report that Google made $4.7 billion from news on its search platform. How much of this is accruing back to the news organizations to fund their journalism? I mean, it is the news organizations and the journalists who are doing the reporting into Brexit or to whatever the issue is. So you, as citizens, can figure out what you want, right? Versus, obviously these campaigns to target advertising and play on people's emotions to manipulate them. It's very difficult for good journalism to compete in that environment.
We highlighted the point that the revenue is being lost to pay the journalists, and we've got all these other various forms. Coming back to the heart of that question, if you'd been the editor, would you have not run that headline, enemies of the people and the judges?
Personally, I would not have.
You would not have. Fair enough, thank you. PDF 5 first, then we'll for the gentleman in front, then the gentleman in front in the red shirt, then the gentleman at the back there. No, come forward here. 1, 2, 3. No, with him, yes. That's it. And then the next one is in front and so.
My name is Rahad Ahmed, I'm an Imam of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and thank you first of all for this lecture and also your comprehensive answer to the earlier question about religious institutions.
Can you hold it closer still?
You said you're an imam?
Yeah, that's right. So thank you for your answer regarding the religious institutions working with the media and journalists. for doing particularly investigative journalists. It's an amazing amount of work that they're doing. They're putting their lives on risk for the truth. The question is, it might sound like criticism, but it's actually trying to seek a way forward in terms of seeing what is, how we can move forward. One of the things I've noted in terms of a conversation with some journalists is that they're saying that they're having to report.
Can we actually get into the question, please?
Yeah, the journalists saying they're having to report on stories on in a very short amount of time, and they're having to make sensational stories. Therefore, they're having to sometimes focus a lot more on negative news, and that applies a lot more to Muslims as well. I was just wondering, is that damaging to society? And if so, what is the way forward? How do we change that?
So I think that ties in very well with what we're just discussing about what is the information environment in which journalism is working. And so now it's the 24/7 news environment, so you've got to get it up quickly. I do think that part of that is the journalism community just competing within itself. I mean, just by a show of hands, how many of you guys care if you get the news 5 minutes after it happens or 5 hours after it happens? Who's for 5 minutes? Okay, who's for 5 hours? And who's just for like whatever, as long as I get it at some point? I mean, I just think the vast majority of people like really don't care if they're getting most of the news within seconds of it happening, right? And there is so much content out there that I wish there was more opportunity to focus on quality over quality over quantity. But again, the information environment, which is predominantly now a couple of social media platforms, some apps, it favors that. It favors the new, it favors the, extreme, the click, what's going to get you to click on it, what's going to get you engaged to it, how long you can spend on the story. But, there are initiatives that are coming up that want to take a different approach. So like Medium, which is a kind of high-quality blogging platform, publishing platform where they want you to be doing quality, and that's their terms of service. This is what we want. You see things like the Solutions Journalism Network, which is devoted to trying to focus more on solution-oriented journalism versus just problems. But the news has, as long as it's been around, primarily been about things that are negative. So it's really hard, I think, also to get those stories by an editor. And if you're an individual, say you're self-publishing or you're a freelancer, try pitching a good news story. Like it's more challenging. But part of that is about the demand from the public. But it's also really hard for us to show our demand when you don't have the opportunity, right? So it's like we're in this vicious circle with these algorithms where we're training them to give us a particular type of news. But in part, that's because we're not given other options for news. So I think part of it is to actively go out and seek alternative news sites and to go to those directly. I also have heard about, I haven't tested them personally, but I've heard that there are filters you can put on your news feed that will give you, say, the opposite political perspective, or the opposite perspective from whatever your algorithm has defined you as. So say you kind of get pro-Democrat stories, you can put this filter on and see what would the kind of conservative people be saying. So I think there are a lot of different ways. I think there's a lot of experimentation happening now in journalism. A lot of it is linked to the sustainability issue. A lot of creativity and interesting things going on. But we, as the public, as individuals, have to send the signals that that's what we want. I think the challenge is we don't always send those signals. But also a challenge is that we don't always get the opportunity to send those signals. So it's a challenge.
Some years back, I think it was Martin Lewis at the BBC, got in trouble with the BBC for saying we should have more news and stories that are good and fun. I supported it. Next question from the gentleman in the front.
I know you said that you've got people you've got the list of the top 10 journalists who are under pressure or under threat. Why don't the so-called big boy journalists use their power on social media to highlight these? I know there was stuff when Khashoggi got
killed, so why don't they go for the smaller ones as well?
Great question. I mean, I think that that is what the One Free Press Coalition is designed to do, is to bring in some of those smaller, local journalists who aren't well known. One of the journalists that we had on the list recently is Mohammed Sheikh Ibn Mohammed, who is a blogger journalist in Mauritania. Yes, who was put in prison and given a death sentence for apostasy. And that was overturned, but that's so much danger that they haven't let him go. So this is not a well-known case. And that is, I think, what this One Free Press Coalition is all about, because it's Forbes, it's AP, it's Washington Post, it's Der Spiegel, Die Welt. All of these news organizations that are saying people are going to give the spotlight to these cases because it really can change the balance of power. But it's also really hard. I mean, there were 250 journalists on our last prison census. There were 54 journalists killed last year alone, 1,344 since we began keeping records, 9 out of 10 of whom still don't have justice. I mean, that could be an entire newspaper, and that's kind of what we are. We are a news service reporting on a daily basis on attacks on the press. But I mean, that's what the Press Freedom Partnership with Washington Post is about. Die Welt in Germany has, I can't remember what it's called right now, but they have an effort where I think it's called Free the Press, where they're highlighting journalists behind bars because they had a journalist who was imprisoned in Turkey, and that kind of made them realize that they could use their power. A lot of the problem is in local communities, they can't really write about those cases, and maybe they're not necessarily on the side of it. So it is part of mobilizing that global media attention. But that is what this list is trying to do.
Gentleman in the red shirt at the front, then the gentleman in the blue shirt at the back.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you to spell out a little bit more one or two things you touched on. I take it that by journalism you're basically referring to what Trump and others call mainstream media.
Not at all.
I mean, how extensive you go, there's Breitbart and HuffPost and so on, and there are millions of people blogging. Who are the journalists? How are you defining them?
Sure.
Point one.
You said not at all at the start of the question.
Yes. Shall I address that first?
Yeah.
So we are called the Committee to Protect Journalists. But when we talk about journalists, we're talking about people who are doing journalism. Journalism is a type of practice. It's about trying to read reporting, gathering facts, trying to be accurate. And journalism can take different forms. It can be that you work, you get paid a salary by a news organization. Maybe you're a freelancer where you sell your stories, or maybe you're a blogger where you self-publish. Now, not all bloggers are journalists, but some bloggers are journalists. So what we at CPJ do, the Committee to Protect Journalists, is we investigate every case. And that means we have to look at what is their body of work, what are they reporting about, what was the context in which they're reporting. But ultimately, because we're the Committee to Protect Journalists and not the Committee to Protect Good Journalists, we protect anyone doing journalism. So, RT is in the news a lot. There have been RT journalists killed in Syria. They were out there covering the war. There is a newspaper called the Red Pepper in Uganda, which I believe is maybe on par with some of the poorest tabloids in Britain. And yet, they're doing journalism. They do not deserve to be put in prison, to be killed, to be threatened and attacked because of what they write. So, and sometimes, I can't remember what country it was, but there was a case where there was a citizen journalist reporting on a protest outside of his window. I think it was one of the stands. And it's incredibly repressive there, very hard to do journalism. He was reporting the protest with the intention to record it and send it outside to a reporter so that they could get published, to document what was happening. And we considered that journalism because he was trying to do journalism in the way that he could in his context. Now, in Syria, there are a lot of citizen journalists. We spent a lot of time investigating every case. You know, is it journalism? Is it activism? It is not a clear line. It is subjective and it's a judgment call. We are one of the more conservative organizations. If you look at the numbers of journalists killed and imprisoned on our lists, it's lower than Reporters Without Borders. We need to double source everything that we do and confirm that the person was a journalist and that the person was threatened, attacked, killed, or imprisoned as a result of their journalism. So, for example, there was a flight, I think going to Brazil to cover the World Cup, and there were a lot of journalists on that flight, and it went down and they died. Now, that is not a press freedom violation. It was not shot down because they were journalists. So this is, I mean, we really spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to figure out, were they doing journalism? But it's not like, you know, it's not a clear line. It's not, you know, you can't just say, this is it, and this is not. And one of the reasons is because we don't want the government determining who is and who is not a journalist. We've seen, for example, in Uganda and Mozambique, they, you know, require press cards for the journalists to work. And what happens? They use those press cards as a way to give out political favor, to retaliate against journalists who don't toe the line, and as a way to, you know, rein in the press. In Egypt, for example, the press syndicate is quasi-governmental, and it doesn't include, you know, freelancers and broadcast journalists. So there's not one good way to determine who is a journalist, and so we look at, are they doing journalism? So do you have a second question?
I just wondered whether there should be, I'm all in favour of defending journalists, as you are, and I admire you for doing it, but should all journalism be defended? I see some outrageous, shocking, dangerous things disseminated around the world, not always in the Times or the Telegraph or the Guardian or the New York Times, but by social media, that I'm shocked by and feel somehow should be stopped.
So should they all be defended?
So should they go to prison because of that? Should you put that person in prison? Is that what you're saying?
Is there some kind of possibility of restraining extreme dangerous journalists?
But so those are very different things. There is about journalism, and we don't get into the quality of journalism. We're not concerned with the quality of journalism. That is absolutely an issue, and that is something that we should be discussing as communities. And there are organizations that work on things like that. Reporters Without Borders has a democracy and information initiative. There's the Ethical Journalism Network. But we are the committee to protect journalists. So we're not going to look at whether you did a good job reporting, whether you made a mistake and accidentally got a fact wrong, because you do not deserve to be imprisoned. You don't deserve to have your house car bombed. You don't deserve to have, you know, to receive rape threats online. You just don't deserve it, even if it's crappy journalism, even if it doesn't, you know, and that's what our focus is. I agree with the problem. There are lots of things to do with that, but I just don't think that the individual who did that deserves to go to jail or deserves to get death threats.
We're almost into censorship there, and it's who watches the watchers. Let's take the gentleman at the back.
Can you talk, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the situation we have here in Europe, where in Hungary, which I've worked in for a long time, we have a situation where a journalist wishing to expose fake news or expose things that the government are doing wrong cannot find a media which will take that reporting. It's easy for the government to actually close down a vehicle, a newspaper it might be, that does carry truth about government problems, or let's call them problems, or dishonesty in whatever way it is. So how can you encourage, how can you support journalists who want to tell the truth in a situation where virtually no media will actually carry the truth if the government doesn't want it out?
Well, I think that goes back to the point of why it's very important not to have, you know, not to say, well, it's only if you work for a mainstream media outlet. I mean, we have seen that in those cases where Hungary, if I recall correctly, the Marius Dragomir from Center for Media Data and Society at the Central European University just did a study on media ownership in Hungary, and it was 80% are owned, you know, by Orban-affiliated or sympathetic it's cronyism. And he's also very sophisticated, right? He didn't just take over the media outright. He got his cronies to buy them up. Same thing happened in Egypt. So I think it's important in that case that they have access to self-publishing, to, there are great things happening online, that there are independent outlets, that there are journalistic collectives, that there are self-publishing platforms. And so unfortunately, in those sort of closed societies where they have dismantled the independent press, that is oftentimes the only option. We are also seeing that there are, a variety of different kind of economic models being created where you have, donor-funded, you have philanthropies that are funding media, you have public-private partnerships, obviously not public-private in Hungary, but these different initiatives that are coming up to try to provide those platforms. But I think that's a case where we really see the value of our information ecosystem, because in a lot of countries, Vietnam, for example, no independent press except for the ones who are working online, and a lot of them use Facebook. A lot of journalists around the world are publishing on Facebook because that's the only outlet, and because it's so big, it has this reach. Because it's based in the US, there is less influence in many cases, their governments, being able to restrict content. But we're also seeing that shift. So it's a very challenging environment. And it's amazing to see, you mentioned Hungary, it's amazing to see Hungary and Poland, there are EU member states that sign on to this charter, these universal values and European values, completely dismantling these institutions. And what are those societies going to do when they can't get access to free and independent information? Because concurrently, if you look at it from the side of the public and the citizenry, while journalists might have access to publish, and especially if they know how to use a VPN, a virtual private network, to overcome censorship if their internet is being censored, not the case in Hungary, but in Vietnam, for example, or China. The problem is we're also seeing that governments are increasingly using internet shutdowns. They're using very sophisticated surveillance and censorship to restrict and combat against that independent reporting. And they're pressuring the social media platforms to remove content. So we've seen this in Vietnam, in Israel-Palestine, in Myanmar. So again, going back to the point of why I've never seen it so bad is because the internet and these platforms are supposed to liberate, and for a while they did, because the journalists and the activists were out first figuring out how to use them. The governments have caught up and are surpassing. And the information is very different. The information environment is very different than it was, say, before the Arab Spring, when it was much more diverse and pluralistic. You have a few now dominant players. And so if you're not able to publish on Facebook, it can be very challenging to reach an audience.
Would you say that in countries, say, that poor human rights records, let's just take on someone like Sudan, when a country like that, do you get more citizen journalism than the average?
I mean, it's really hard to say, because you have like a lot of citizen journalism in the US and the UK, because that's what people want to do.
So the press free.
Right. So yeah, I don't think you can necessarily say that. In some countries, citizen journalism is almost like the only option. For a while in Ethiopia, for example. Yeah, I mean, in Ethiopia, there was almost no independent press except for some bloggers. So there were like the Zone 9 bloggers, for example, who were reporting about human rights in Ethiopia and reporting about the democracy movement. They, not surprisingly, were then thrown in jail. Now we saw, actually for the first time since we began keeping records, there are no journalists in jail in Ethiopia because you have this political transition, but it's not codified yet. Right? When I used to live in Egypt, I did my doctoral research in Egypt, and before the Arab Spring, there were no journalists in jail at that time. And now Egypt is the top 3 jailer of journalists. Yeah, so things can really change pretty quickly. And right now, for example, in Egypt, you've got this outlet called Mada Masr, which is an online news outlet. It's professional journalists, but the only reason they can really make it is because they can publish online. They have a website, but Egypt is censoring more than hundreds of websites. So it's really this game of cat and mouse, The journalists are the mice and they're losing.
Do we have any more questions? In which case, I'm going to close with one. You said that governments and politicians are responsible for half the deaths.
Murders.
Murders, yes. Who's responsible for the other half?
Yeah, so it could be militias, it could be killed in crossfire, so, it could be military groups, drug cartels, so non-state actors, terrorist groups. Is there a range of different actors?
So basically
Business people.
Anyone not wanting to be exposed.
Correct, exactly. Yeah.
That's a great note on which to end, and what I think has been a fascinating evening. We've learned a lot. We owe a great debt to those who put their lives in danger to bring us the stories. Whether it's in 5 minutes or in 5 hours, matters not. They were there, they were shot at, they were threatened. I interviewed Stefan Lew recently, who was investigating people smuggling in Eastern Europe, and he was dragged out of a shopping centre into a car park, and they put a gun to his head and told him to go away. I said, "What did you do?" He said, "I went back." And it is people with that courage that give us the stories. And thank you for what you do in protecting them and helping to look after them. Ladies and gentlemen, Courtney Radsch.